to see that we have over 100 people joining us tonight to hear from Roberto Lovato, who is our guest speaker, our speaker of honor. Roberto is a writer, reporter, educator, and activist, and he's the author of Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas. As Beth said, I'll introduce Roberto now, and then we'll show a brief trailer about the book. So Roberto Lovato was born in San Francisco here in the US to Salvadoran parents and raised in the historic Mission District. His accomplishments are too many to fit into this introduction because I would like to give him the spotlight tonight and have enough time to tell us about himself, but a few highlights are here. He was co-founder of the Central American Studies program at California State University at Northridge, one of the first programs of its kind, or the first program of its kind. He was also a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley in the Latino Policy Research Center. He received a grant from the Pulitzer Center for Reporting, and he's reported on violence, terrorism, the drug war, and the refugee crisis from Mexico, Venezuela, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, France, and the US, among other countries. He's also been an activist. He was involved in the fight against California's Proposition 187, and he helped conceive of the Drop the I Word illegal immigrant campaign, and he co-founded Presencia.org, the country's largest online Latinx organization. If I could just remind everyone to mute yourselves if you don't mind, just to eliminate the background noise. Roberto was also part of a recent movement called #Dignidad Literaria, which advocated for more visibility and publishing opportunities for Latinx authors. So before I continue on the topic of the conversation tonight, I'd like to just pause and we'll show the book trailer.
Erin, while I set that up, I just want to let you know Mario is asking us to slow down a little bit so he can interpret.
I highly respect that as a translator. Mario, I will speak slower. Thank you.
Whoops. Apologies. This should just take a second.
Yes.
Oh, I want you. I didn't know you were back.
Hi, my name is Roberto Lovato, journalist and author of Unforgetting, a reported memoir excavating the real American dirt beneath headlines about MS-13, caged Central American children, and the humanitarian crisis of immigration. Headlines in which the voices of Central Americans in the United States have been silenced and forgotten. Unforgetting is also about an underworld journey, my journey across the cities, forests, and deserts of the 2,500-mile chain of forgotten, dead, and devalued life that begins in El Salvador, where I visit mass graves, morgues, and hideouts where gangs and governments have killed, dismembered, and disappeared their victims for decades. Along the way, I encounter gang leaders, death squad operatives, and guerrilleras who reveal their sometimes startling truths. Unforgetting also chronicles my inward journey to find the stories of revolutionary hope, poetic imagination, and the tenderness that survives the terror. Unforgetting also leads me to Los Angeles, the birthplace of the gangs that would later be exploited for political gain. Eventually, I returned to my birthplace, San Francisco's Mission District, to the stories of my immigrant family, including those of my father Ramon, who bore the astonishing secret that would alter my life. I'd like to invite you on this journey towards forgotten love and healing that we must all take if we are to face the crises of our time. Please join me in the adventure of Unforgetting.
Thank you, Ben. So Unforgetting is an important contribution, not just about El Salvador and Roberto's personal stories, but to the larger realm of historical and collective memory. And in case some people here tonight aren't familiar with those terms, I'll just remind us that history and the past can be thought of as two different concepts. So the past is everything that ever happened anywhere in the world. And history is the way it's recorded. That can be individual recollections of history, it could be what we read in textbooks, it's what survives the ages. So history and the stories that comprise it are sometimes different from the past, especially when memory is suppressed, which is the topic of Roberto's book, both personal memory and collective memory in El Salvador. So Roberto, it's a pleasure to have you here and an honor for you to speak with us tonight. And in your memoir, you cite the phrase that you often saw in El Salvador in your visits home, which was ver, oír y callar, to see, hear, and shut up, or silence. And so I'd like to thank you for using your voice to do the opposite, to share your story and your experiences with us tonight and in your memoir. And I also wanted to mention that speaking of oír and hearing and listening, I was able to listen to your voice as you read your book on Audible. And so if you haven't read this yet, I would say take the chance to hear it and you'll hear Roberto tell his story in his own voice. So Roberto, thank you so much for being here tonight. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Beth and U.S. Sister Cities, my old friends that I've known for so many years, and it's beautiful that you're still surviving when so many organizations have passed, gone the way of, businesses in COVID-19 or, progressive organizations that died in these 90s or 2000s. So it's really a great pleasure to be at home. I feel at home because Jose Artiga, I'm sure many of you know, one of the key, players in Sister Cities, and Eileen and other people. I had a lot of friends that worked for Sister Cities, and I've known people in Sister Cities throughout the U.S. over the years. So I'm very pleased. I also just want to give a shout out to my good friend Edwin Argueta there in Boston, who I saw is there, who's been a long time friend, and he's actually from my mom's hometown, San Vicente, and we joke a lot about that. So it just adds another layer of hominess to me. And I really applaud you for your work because, oftentimes when I travel around the world with my work and, I see solidarity with Haiti, I saw solidarity with El Salvador, solidarity with Guatemala. And in the case of some of these places like Haiti, it became fashionable and then people went on and moved on to something else. And I don't know what it is about El Salvador and Salvadoreños, but we seem to inspire solidarity that's like long lasting. We're like keepers of solidarity because I'm sure many of you have many years that you've been doing this. Like, I don't know, it was Beth who said, that they've been doing this work since 1990 or something. So, yeah, I love this and I feel very at home, and I'm honored that you would invite me to talk a little bit about my book and my experiences. So what I thought I would do would be just to give you a little bit more from the video that my partner Rebecca and my good some good friends put together. So after I tell you a little bit about the book, then I want to just read and then more engage in a conversation, if I may. Okay. So I never thought at firstly I was going to write a memoir. I've been a journalist for, I don't know, almost 20 years. And prior to that, I was an activist doing different things in El Salvador with a group many of you are familiar with, like Criptes. And then I was also active in another group, you might know, the FMLN. Not this FMLN, because this FMLN today is not your mom's FMLN. This is another FMLN, and I'm not a part of that one. So, but we need something like the old FMLN to come in and kind of take care of business in El Salvador right now, I think. Just to preview kind of my feelings about that. So I never thought I would write a memoir. I'm a journalist and, but then I realized like, I wanted to connect the dots that run from the present day imagery that you saw in the video, the caging of children that began with Obama, that was continued by Trump, and now continued by Biden. Conditions are as bad as ever, but it's not in the news, which is an example of official forgetting, right? When Democrats do it, it's okay because the cages they put the children in are made of cotton candy. But when evil Trump does it, it's evil. This is the kind of country we live in. And anybody dealing with El Salvador knows that the policies have been bipartisan, whether it's bipartisan war policies or bipartisan immigration policies. So I've learned over the years that whoever's in power does not really want to be accountable for what happened in El Salvador. And especially when it comes to mass murder and mass migration. And there's just a lot of official forgetting. I mean, to the point where I actually did a study under the auspices of the Columbia Journalism Review. I had some volunteers help me out to look at the reporting when everybody was making a lot of noise about Trump's caging and separating children from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And in addition to the reporting, kind of drawing this artificial line to say that Obama didn't do it, because there's this really mass movement to protect Obama's legacy, even though, we all know, anybody that knows Central America knows that he was the one that started caging, separating children and pushing them to their deaths in the desert. And these are stories you just don't hear. So I'm like, man, I'm getting bothered, I'm getting pissed off. And so I decided I want to write this story in 2015. And then I realized like, well, what's underneath that story is a deeper history that many of you know, but that hasn't been told. And that hasn't been told by Salvadoreños. Like in that study I did with the Columbia Journalism Review, I looked at the reporting on child separation from the perspective of how many Salvadoran or Central American scholars are in the stories, how many Salvadoran, Central American lawyers are in the stories, how many Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Honduran community leaders, nonprofit leaders are in the story, how many Salvadoran, Central American journalists are in the story. Does anybody want to guess how many I found in hundreds of stories with volunteers? Yes, Joan Lorien gets the prize of the day. She gave the sign, ni mierda, not a fucking one. Not a single Central American in a story about children being jailed, caged, separated from their mothers by Trump and by Obama prior to that, right? But not a single Central American source in the stories. And I knew why they wouldn't put, for example, me on there, because I'm going to say, well, Jay Johnson started caging the children. Obama had Jay Johnson do that. So there was a complete official silence, as if we were in Argentina during the Dirty War. And so I said, I'm going to do something about this. This pisses me off. It really angered me. And I decided to write this book at it. But then I realized, like, I don't think I can tell the story just as a journalist, because there's a back end story to my father that if you really want to understand the roots of the violence, you have to go back to the foundation of El Salvador in the 19th century. Because El Salvador, if you talk to scholars like I have, like at Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or, any eminent institution that's, studying these matters, anybody serious will tell you El Salvador has been one of the most consistently violent places on earth. And so, the way to look at Salvadoran history is not just in terms of like the war, 1932, but it's actually as a consistently violent place. And the 1932, the La Matanza is just a spike. The war in the 80s is a spike, and the gangs now is a spike. But all of these spikes have beneath them a consistent layer of violence that has affected our families for decades and since the 1820s. So I can't tell the story of my father, what my father knew, what I discovered about my father as a journalist. And then I'm like, wow, actually, I'm probably gonna have to talk about myself too. Because as you will read, when I was a kid and I had hair, tenía pelo colocho, I was crazy. I joined a clique. We were called Los Originales in San Francisco, and we were, fighting, we were stealing, we were robbing people, we were, doing drugs, dealing drugs, and we were, cruising lowriders in San Francisco on Mission Street. And, I thought that would be valuable knowledge to help people understand what some of these gang kids today are dealing with, because it's a different moment. They're different gangs. We weren't like hardened, kind of dudes in my case. We were, we were doing crime, but we weren't doing like really heavy stuff like the guys are shuttling in and out of California prisons. But still there's the story that I've heard time and again from top level gang leaders to low level gang leaders, which is how fucked up their fathers are. Bad fathering is a major part of what turns a young man into a member of a gang. I thought, well, it could be useful for me to help people understand MS 13 and 18th Street, not just in the journalism that I've done in talking to top level gang leaders and low level gang leaders, but also to talk about my own life and my dad. And if I'm going to talk about my dad, then I got to talk about 1932 because he was alive then. And he has like this heavy secret that I don't want to share because I want you to read my book, right? So, that and it would blow the story from a narrative point of view because le puse mucho amor, I really worked hard on the book and I try to make it as beautiful as possible. And then so if I'm going to tell my dad's story, I'm going to tell my story as a person that was in a clique, and then the story of the war and my decision to go from San Francisco to San Salvador in Chalatenango to join the FMLN as an urban commando. I can't write it as a journalist because how am I going to journalize my own life, right? So I decided I'm going to write this memoir, and I'm going to write it creatively because I think we often lose ourselves at the exoticism and the grandiosity that people make of violence. And I don't want to play that. I don't want to play porno violence, right? What is it called? The pornography of violence. Right? I didn't want to give myself to that. But I did want to tell a true story at the same time of what I know about violence in different realms, from reporting on gangs to the war to narco violence that I've seen and reported on, and then the research and things and interviews I've done with people that are have experienced extreme violence in the 30s in El Salvador. So to do it creatively, I thought it needed to be beautiful for one. And because, one of the questions I had was, when you write a book, you often want to answer a question. And one of the questions that I had, of the 3 or 4 questions I had, was, why didn't I put a fucking bullet in my head? What made me survive, right? What made me decide to keep going in those moments when I wanted to take myself out from so much accumulated violence that I've lived, that I've witnessed, and that I've had rained upon me. So I thought, wow, what was it? Well, it was the love and it was the beauty. It was the sublime and the beautiful, and the love that I saw in the Salvadoran people was what helped me overcome. And so I thought the way to get a reader to kind of follow me on this journey into the underworld of violence, of the secrets of states, of the secret of the state of El Salvador, the secrets of the state of the United States with the School of the Americas, the trainers, the Pentagon, the LAPD, the underworld of my dad's history, the underworld of my family, the underworld of the gangs, the underworld of migration and migrants. I decided, I was going to include poetry that is very much a part of our lives, mythology, which is a part of our lives, reporting, memoir, using different tools to get at the unspeakable, right? Because if you read the book, you'll notice I barely use the word trauma because I think it's a cheap phrase at this point in history because so many people have used it for so many, for me, insubstantial things that don't carry the weight of what I understand to be violence, like genocide, like war, like rape, like major gang violence. I mean, there are kids writing these memoirs that are selling on Instagram that are, they're talking about trauma, and it's the trauma of, doesn't resemble the things that I know to be trauma. So I don't use the word trauma much, but still there is this thing that's in our lives that is extreme and that we can't look at and that is unspeakable, untouchable, but is there doing the work that makes, for example, for a good gang member, if you look at a gang member is nothing if not a walking, talking, unresolved trauma. So I wanted to kind of bring the reader into these spaces that we can't talk about, but that we need to talk about. It's the paradox of Salvadoran life. To speak is impossible, not to speak is impossible. That's the paradox with things like extreme violence. So the way to get at these things is poetry, storytelling, mythology, reporting, memoir, oral history, all these different instruments that are at our disposal as a writer to kind of get at the unspeakable. So one of the dominant myths was the underworld journey into all those underworlds that I mentioned, right? The underworlds of the FMLN, the underworld of the gangs, the underworld of mass grave sites, the underworld of family secrets, the underworld of the death squads that I interviewed and that persecuted me, the underworld of the gangs and the underworld of the migration journey. I'm going to end with this because I want to get into the Q&A there. The other thing I did in the book was to use metaphors, and I try to make it beautiful. For example, and that's what the beauty of metaphors and poetry, right? There's something about them that they make for, they kind of stir the imagination in unique ways. So I came up with the idea of, I was trying to get at the way that even just nations themselves, their existence is de facto violence, right? The existence of nations from an indigenous perspective is a perpetual violence. And so I came up with the term machete of memory, right? To describe the way I see borders. For example, the ultimate machete of memory is the border, the US-Mexico border, right, for us, because it cuts us off from the past. The way they report on immigration doesn't include what sociologists call the push factors in the countries of origin, or US capitalism, or US history, or US militarism. Instead, it's about the border. Donald Trump does it. Barack Obama talks about the border. Biden is trying to send Kamala Harris and other right-wing, advisors of hers. But it's really the story is still located at the border, when the border is kind of in terms of science, it's an illusion, right? There's no such thing as a border in terms of geography, in terms of the land, in terms of geology. It's a construct, but it's a dangerous, murderous construct. And so I came up with the idea of the machete of memory because, our memory is chopped up by nation states. Our memory is chopped up by violence of nation states. our memories are chopped up by virtue of being born in the modern era. We are alienated, as Marx says, from ourselves. And that alienation includes a heavy component of memory. And so, and Salvadoreños, we have a very great agricultural history. And if you visit families here in the US that are Salvadoreño, a lot of them will have machetes in the living room. Of course, somebody coming from who doesn't know us is going to come to our houses or our apartments. It's going to say, damn, man, you some violent ass people. When in fact, it's an expression of pride and not what pseudo reporters like Lisa Ling or CNN and others have turned the gangs into the most violent gang on earth, which has no statistical basis, right? As I show in the book, there's no statistical basis to say that MS-13 or 18th Street are the most violent gangs on earth. Those are kind of monsterification, so to speak. They are constructs. So I use the machete of memory to describe different ways that memory works in the modern age. And I see the job of a writer is to kind of rebuild or remember the shards, the bones of memory. So I go to forensics labs. I go to my grandmother's sewing machine for inspiration as to what we need to do as writers is sew back together the bones of memory. And so like my abuelita, Mamate, in the 1930s, after La Matanza and before, was raised my father in a shanty town, un mesón, Salvadoran shanty town. And Mamate was dealing with women who, were the majority in this shanty town, who were mostly sex workers. And many of them were indigenous women who came from the countryside after La Matanza and had to hide their identities as indigenous people because it became very dangerous to be indigenous in the 1930s after La Matanza, wiped out tens of thousands of indigenous people. So you're not apt to kind of come out and be proud about your indigenous identity after what scholars at Oxford told me is the single most violent episode in world history as far as the numbers of people killed per day, per week, in a concentrated space and time, right? That's in the book, a guy named Anders Sandberg. So my abuelita, Mamate, was with raising my dad in the shanty town. She was a seamstress, and she would work with, she would make dresses for sex workers who were indigenous women hiding their identity, who would, confide in my abuelita to say they wanted some of their identity back and they wanted a dress that would make them feel special. And so the act of sewing by my abuelita became symbolic, again, like forensic science, of what we need to do as writers is reconstruct the bones of memory in what, in America Latina le llaman memoria histórica, the use of memory in the service of justice. Or in the case of the word unforgetting, I got it from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who, when she was looking at the workings of memory and fascism in Germany, was in conversation with her former lover, Martin Heidegger, who was really obsessed with this concept of aletheia, which for the Greeks meant truth, which also means unforgetting in Greek, aletheia. And so the Greeks associated unforgetting with truth. And so Hannah Arendt took this idea when she was looking at fascism and the way that amnesia creates fascism to as a form of, I guess, what I would call memoria histórica, as a way to fight back in the realm of culture and memory. So that's really what this little book's about. Is about my best effort to undertake a political act of unforgetting things that are intimate in my family, with my father, with the rest of my family, with my Salvadoran identity, with my identity as a person born in the United States, because the violence in El Salvador is nothing if not a major expression of US violence, right? I mean, my friend Greg Granting Pulitzer Prize winning historian, says that the first death squad in the Americas was the Rangers, the Texas Rangers, right? And the people started getting the idea to create death squads because of the Texas Rangers. Yeah, people in other parts of the world, like France and Algeria, and others. So, how are we on time? Maybe I should just leave it there and we can start the conversation, Aaron. Or do you want me to read something? People often like people to read. I don't know.
I think well, first of all, I want to say that you've achieved your goal. The book is so beautifully written. The metaphor, the imagery, and actually, as you were talking, I was looking for a passage I can't find, so I would love if you read something. But the passage that came to mind was that paradox of beauty and violence, because you were en route with your driver to go to a mass grave, and you described at one point the scenery. You were on a path called La Ruta de las Flores, the path of the flowers, and you can really envision this lush area. And yet that soil and that earth that was so verdant had been fertilized by so many dead bodies, which allows us as readers to understand that beauty and violence can coexist and helps us to envision a path forward. So thanks for all the beauty in your history, but I would love if you could just read a short passage now.
Okay. All right. So one of my, part of the journey was to go and understand how, El Salvador and the migration journey itself is kind of this. I saw a set of interconnected mass graves. So mass graves are for me are just part of the awful truth of humanity and inhumanity, right? Because human beings dug those things. Human beings did that to other human beings. And they're also reflective of kind of the chaos, right? A bunch of different bones of different people buried. It's a super dehumanizing, a symbol of dehumanization, to say the least, and crimes against humanity. And so, I mean, there are also symbols of I hate to use a word, but trauma, unresolved trauma, when you have this mass grave that hasn't been dug, hasn't been investigated. There are hundreds of mass graves in El Salvador, the vast majority of which have not been, and I'm talking about from the war, just the war. The vast majority have not been dug, they have not been investigated, they have not been documented, the families have not gotten the bones back. So those are open wounds for those families who don't have the bones of their loved ones. And so I view there's a poetry in forensics, right? There's a poetry there that in the act of actually using science to dig up these bones of all these different people, of 5, 10, 20, hundreds of people in a mass gravesite, and piece them together, whether in Chalatenango, in Las Aradas, or in El Mozote, where almost 1,000 people were killed. So there's a poetry in forensics that's parallel to the act of writing, for me, of stitching together words to bring the integrity of our existence back to some semblance of humanity. And so, I really fell in love with forensics in being Salvadoreño and being a writer. And so I visited a forensics lab, the top forensics lab, one of the busiest in the world, because El Salvador, when I'm there in 2015, was the most violent country on earth in terms of homicides, right? Homicide statistics, because there's other measures of violence that make it the United States hands down the most violent country on earth in terms of the exportation of death and the weaponry of death, and then the slow death of its policies, of its economic and war policies, for example. They're, unprecedented and unmatched. But let's just, for conversation's sake, say that I'm in El Salvador in 2015. I'm visiting a forensics lab after going to mass grave sites. And I'm talking to Saul Quijada, who's this pretty eminent forensic scientist. So I'm in the lab with him, and he's showing me bones and things. And here we go. El Mozote has become the biggest test of whether President Cristiani's 1993 amnesty grant will continue to block prosecution of any crimes against humanity in El Salvador. If and when the current calls for accountability by human rights, legal and non-governmental organizations around the world are heeded, any possibility for justice requires that the science be exacting, able to tell the story of the incident with as much precision as possible. All of it, Quijada says, his face somber. The ages of the victims, the volume of the people massacred, the bones of babies, still impacts me 22 years later after we started working on El Mozote. Anyone who says they can forget this is either inhuman or lying. We walk over to another skeleton. This one looks newer. Other skeletons rest next to it, along with the boxes of bones. Who's that? Individuals killed more recently. Some of them were 12-year-olds. We're also seeing more violence against women, he says. The gang victims and their killers filling El Salvador's mass graves are, in fact, getting younger. Quijada says, around 2000, the average age of victims was 30 to 35, and then 20 to 30, says Quijada. From 2010 to the present, we started seeing ages decrease from 17-year-olds to 15-year-olds. I focus on my breath and try to regain composure and think back to my readings about forensics and the Locard principle. Conceptualized by Edmond Locard, the son of a French anarchist, poet, and founder of the Lyon Police Technical Laboratory, one of the first Western forensic labs. In 1910, the Locard principle is premised on the idea that all contact leaves a trace, and not just the contact involved in the criminal act on its location. It says that every crime scene leaves material and therefore measurable evidence. Dirt, DNA, gunpowder, blood on any who interact with it. By the same token, the principle also posits that each of us leaves unique traces of ourselves: hair, DNA, spit, shoe imprints at the crime scene in return. I meditate on how, under the Locard principle, the grave sites I visited both in wartime El Salvador and on this trip, the mass graves dug by cartels in Mexico and those dug by untrained justices of the peace in Texas, have all left part of themselves in me and I in them. I'll just leave it there because, I could go on, but I want to converse.
Thank you. And I have a list of questions, but we have 15 minutes. So I want to defer to the audience. And so I'll remind people you're welcome to put your questions in the chat. And if there's a silence, I'll go into my questions. But there is a first question from Jeanette Miranda. And the question is, do you believe the statistics have declined as claimed by the current president? And I think we could take that two ways. Does that mean that as Biden states, there's been a decline in the number of Central Americans trying to come into the US through the Mexican border? Or does that mean by Salvadoran President Bukele that violence is actually declining in El Salvador? So in general, do you think things are improving?
No. Next question.
Okay.
No, I think that violence and the documentation of violence is a complicated matter. Let me just start off by saying I think Bukele is a sophisticated, media-savvy neo-fascist, and he's playing the chords of the military dictatorship as far as amnesia, as far as authoritarianism and the authoritarian identity, and but he's adding like this new social media, this younger, hipper kind of dictatorial power that he's exercising, like when he takes out the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. I mean, and he's military. He's a militarist, and he's deployed the death squads basically against the gangs, just like Leonel Sanchez Seren and Arena presidents and FMLN presidents before him, right? So, and as far as the statistics go, you have to look at reports in El Faro and from gang members that I've talked to who are friends who've told me basically that the decrease in the homicides has its balance almost, not to an exact, but there's a balance in the desaparecidos in El Salvador right now. There's increases in the number of people disappeared. And so the way the negotiations that Bukele has undertaken, which he's trying to hide, that the FMLN undertook, that Arena undertook, they kind of like, they make these deals. All right, you can go disappear people, but bring the homicide rate down, make us look good.
So a question that ties into that, and for people who don't know, Bukele is the current president, and he did win with a reported 80% of the vote, which is questionable because there was a lot of abstention in the elections. But we have a question from Catherine Cates, which is related, which is, does Bukele's approval ratings currently signify an exercise in national forgetting? So do Salvadorans want to put this history in their past?
They want to, but they won't, for one, right? You don't resolve violence and the memory of violence and the effects of violence by voting in a neo-fascist who's going to deny it. Like Bukele denying judges and investigators access to military archives that would clarify some of the major crimes against humanity during the war. So he's committed to amnesia as much as anyone else. And he has a layer of social media savvy that complicates things further. So I think that consider, for example, I report this in my book. There was a poll in La Prensa, I believe, of Salvadoreños about La Matanza, 1932, which again, according to Anders Sandberg at Oxford and other scholars I've interviewed, El Salvador 1932 is, according to them, the single most violent moment in world history as far as the numbers of people killed in a concentrated space, in such a concentrated space in time, in like a couple of weeks. So, I mean, people killed per day, per week, etc. So there's a poll by La Prensa of how many people know that even La Matanza happened. Something like 70% did not know. Consider that. It's like, it's the closest thing El Salvador has to the Holocaust. And 70% of people today don't know what it is, don't know that it happened. So then, if you talk to psychologists or students of fascism or, people like me, you're gonna get somebody that says you have a population that has a high degree of, unresolved pain and denial, and they've normalized extreme violence through amnesia. So that when you have that many people not knowing La Matanza, you're enabling the violence to continue, because if you perpetrate violence against me and I forget it, you're more than likely to continue it. That applies to individuals. It applies to militaries, to police, to entire nations, right? I mean, the United States is nothing if not an unresolved genocide against the indigenous people on which it is founded, right? And most nation states are like that. Mexico's like that. El Salvador, most nation states are built upon the bones of indigenous people. So that's why I was saying that nation states themselves are an act of violence, of extreme violence, that's been normalized in our lives. So anyway, I don't want to get too philosophical, but yeah.
Okay, so I'll try to weave in a bit of history and a question I have and a question from Sarah Pineda, who's in the chat. So you've mentioned in the book and tonight 3 historical moments in El Salvador. We could add a 4th. If we add an original moment, you could say the conquistadores that went to El Salvador and wiped out some of the indigenous population. Then we've got 1932, La Matanza, which was the 30,000 civilians were killed. Then in the 1980s, there was a civil war, a peace accord in the early 90s, and then we jump to this present moment of violence with gangs. And I think there is a misperception or a lack of history around people thinking that the gangs were imported from El Salvador, when in fact, people fleeing the civil war, arriving in the US, joining gang communities in LA, and then returning to El Salvador and sort of importing that gang culture. So I wanted to clarify all those historical points and then bring that back to you, because your family has had part in this history. As you alluded, I won't give away the spoiler of the 1932, but you yourself were involved in the gang community in LA. You've also were part of FMLN in a different instance of its time. And you mentioned you're finding out more about your own indigenous roots and coming from a long line of single mothers in El Salvador. So all of that to tie into a first question, which is how did you connect to your own indigenous roots? Sarah is from Chalate and says she doesn't know much about her community. So how did you tie into that? And was this own search for your identity part of your motivation to write the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't write the book to search for my identity, but in the process, I needed to excavate some of the bones of my own memory. And when you do that, you're bound to, if you're honest and especially if you go down into the deep pain, you're bound to alter who you are, who you think you are. Same thing with nations, right? When we, excavate the bones of all the crimes against humanity of nation states like the United States or El Salvador, we're going to change the identities of these, I believe. So, I grew up with an ambiguous connection to my indigenous identity. Firstly, I didn't know that my bisabuelas, my great grandmothers on both sides of my family, on my mother, Maria Elena Alvarenga Lovato's family, and my father, Ramon Alfredo Lovato's family, had indigenous women, Our great grandmothers were indigenous, Pipil Nahuatl. So I to get to my indigenous identity, I had a border wall of racism within our families, right? Because there's this term the Salvadoreños use even today, Indio. And they use it in a lot of, I know Edwin can, identify what I'm talking about and others. To say somebody's ugly, you say cara de indio, Indian face. To say somebody's backward or stupid, indio patas rajadas. These phrases are normalized, are baked into the Salvadoran language and the Salvadoran subconscious and identity in a lot of ways. The nation state in El Salvador is a racial state. If you look at, for example, the La Matanza of 1932, the myth is that all the indigenous people were wiped out. They weren't wiped out. What happened, though, was that indigenous identity went underground. So that in my dad's hometown, for example, you had, before La Matanza in January 1932, you look at the statistics of births in his town, most of the children were indigenous. If you look at the birth records after January 1932, suddenly there's this new category called campesino. Okay, so either what happened, right? What happened was that what we call peasant and campesino is a transformed indigenous person, an identity created by the state, for the state, because indigenous identity is very problematic for the racial states that exist. Through the 1930s, you had, for example, in Haiti, a massacre of epic proportions as well, perpetrated by Trujillo in Dominican Republic. And so, Trujillo, if you look at Trujillo, he was Black. His features were Black, but he was trying to create a racial state that was not identified as Black. And it's a real clear example of the way that states racialize. Look, we live in the United States. right? We don't need to go far to see the racial state, the workings of the racial state. What's happening now, though, is interesting because we're entering a stage where we have what I call the intersectional empire. So that you have queer Afro-Latina women heading up the Pentagons pretty soon, and they're going to bomb just like Obama, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon, but they're going to have rainbow-colored flags on the bombs, right? This is kind of the new age of race that we're entering. And Obama previewed that. So, but in any case, getting to indigenous identity was a big thing, and it's still a work in progress for me because it's something I have to actually rescue. I want to learn now what, I know some words, but I want to really try to dig there deeper to kind of understand better. Thank you for that question, Sarah.
So we only have a few minutes left, so I want to turn to the
I can stay a little bit more if you want.
Maybe we'll take 5 to 7 more minutes if people are okay. To tie questions about the present and also people wondering how they can help. And we always hope for optimism, right? So Edwin asks a question. Do you think President Biden's real Central American policy, is there one really? What do you make of the recent announcements to make considerable investments in the region? As we know, there are people in the current administration in Central America this week. So what do you think about that? And if that's the collective, then on an individual level, what do you think that could be done either through the Sister Cities project or as individuals to help shed light on this?
Well, I have to go back to the wisdom of my childhood for an answer to my friend Edwin's question. That's what I think of Biden's policy. It's the same old BS in new bottles, same wine in new bottles. It's rotten wine, it stinks. It's the combination of, it's the same combination of neoliberal economic policies backed by militarism, right? So look at the people heading up Biden's policies. Start there. You have a guy named Zuniga, who's this right-wing Honduran, who's descended of a fascist family, right? His father was this guy. His grandfather, General Zuniga, was a fascist murderer in Honduras, and he's a former national security operative who cut his teeth in the Obama era, helping stage coups and undermine governments. And this is the main attaché to the former head cop in California, Kamala Harris. And then there's another Colombian guy, I forget his name right now, but he's, he was in the National Security Agency. So you have all these right-wing war hawk intelligence types leading Central America policy. So it's clear that Central America policy continues to be a national security concern, but it's a national security concern, not because, we were trying to overthrow the government like we did back in the day, but because of climate change. That climate change is unleashed along with neoliberalism and just the history of the region of US intervention has unleashed an unresolvable problem of violence, migration, impoverishment. And so the policies that Biden is pushing are just more of the same stuff. So so what you can do is really, I think, educate yourselves about, first of all, tener lujo de detalle with respect to what policies these people are pushing. And then, don't buy the intersectional empire. Just because you have a black person as president or a black vice president, it doesn't matter one fucking bit. It doesn't matter if there's a Latino or a Latina or a queer woman in any of these departments. If they're still promoting policies that cage, separate, and kill Central American children, that's a fascist policy, even if Barack Obama's doing it, right? So have the courage of your convictions to really look into the abyss of this moment and be honest and truthful to say, look, we're being fooled in sophisticated ways now, because that's what's happening. We're being, it's not just Fox News. I would argue as a journalist, MSNBC. How many Central Americans are talking about these Central American issues on MSNBC? Again, ni mierda, not one. And you have like, they put in an occasional Latina from Texas, who's this kind of right-wing Democrat who's never been to Central America, but hey, she's got great opinions that, support the Biden administration. They created AstroTurf groups on immigration to be the representatives for migrant groups that are like being left out of the conversation. So have the courage of your convictions and the militancy of story to tell the story in a militant way. Like, be really hard about it. We need to spark the radical imagination right now. Great danger is coming. I'm not going to bullshit people. That's why I wrote my book, having witnessed war in El Salvador, visited genocidal locations in Guatemala, gang violence in the extreme, narco violence in Mexico, and ongoing violence in the US. Having reported on, visited, engaged in some of this stuff, I wrote the book because I wanted people to see how badass Salvadoreños are. We have a story to tell Salvadoreños. We as a people have overcome so much, so much. Just go to Teocinte, you talk to those people, you admire them, you love them because they are survivors, they overcome, and that they can smile after seeing what they've seen, and they can fight back and fight effectively because they're Chalatecos, and Chalatenango is nothing, if my memory is not Chalatenango heroico. So I wrote the book to communicate the power and the sublime beauty of the Salvadoran people, so that it's not just about El Salvador, it's about the US. And it's not just for people in El Salvador or people in the US, but it's not a universal story, but it's a story that I believe if people read, they can access stories of a people that have overcome great odds that could be called apocalyptic. And we're going to need those stories. We're going to need that kind of power to face, neo-fascism on the rise, to face neoliberal economic policy, to face the absence of political imagination that reigns in the Democratic Party. And after we face all that, we're then going to have to face the fight of our lives, climate change. So you're being conditioned to be depressed when you hear that. I'm not. I'm Salvadoreño. I don't have time to be depressed about that stuff. I've had to overcome in my own life too much at this point to not bust my ass to do what I do in as powerful and beautiful ways I can. And so I guess that's really my answer. I don't have like an answer that says, hey, donate to Sister Cities, which obviously I would encourage everybody to donate to Sister Cities because they do good work. But really, you have to unleash the kraken of your radical imagination right now. That's the message in the book. It's about that and about the tenderness that survives the terror of the United States.
Thank you. So I'll remind people that just being here tonight is a way to make a difference. Reading this book and informing yourself is a way to make a difference. We've put in the chat, there are many good resources from people in the audience, and also a link to donate to the Sister Cities National Project. Here on the Arlington Teocinte level, we're working to raise money to improve the water system in the village. So these are small, concrete ways to feel like you're making some sort of difference. And Roberto, you ended and began your book with a poem by the famous Salvadoran poet Roque, referring to the massacre in 1932 and the trauma that's been inherited. And so I just wanted to end tonight by reading a couple of lines from that. I'll read it in Spanish and then you translated it so beautifully. You said, Roque said, "Todos nacimos medio muertos. Todos juntos tenemos más muerte que aquellos. Pero todos juntos tenemos más vida que ellos." So to paraphrase, many Salvadorans may have been born half dead from the various traumas of the past and the present. But today, together, if you put us together, we may have more death, but we also have more life. So we have more possibility among us to educate each other and to foster change. So that's the mission of the Sister Cities Project and our mission tonight with having you here. And I want to thank you once again on behalf of the Arlington and Cambridge Sister Cities initiatives for sharing your historias, your personal stories and histories with all of us, and for taking the time to write this book and make it accessible.
Honor, can I say something just before we
Of course.
check out here?
Yeah.
I talked early on about some of the more abysmal and heavy things, but the real point of what I'm doing in the book is it's an optimistic book, believe it or not. Because it's not just the optimism of some, a lot of the, let me just be frank, a lot of my peers in the literary community, some lightweight bullshit out there right now. Like, how much of what literature out there is preparing you for this epic moment of epic crisis? That's the question that I ask myself when I read a book right now, or when I watch something on film. I mean, it's good to get things that distract me or take me away from facing the abyss, but we have to face the abyss. There's no way around it. You have to face it, and it's going to look back at you, but we can arm ourselves. And I guess that's what I was trying to do with the book. And I just hope that spirit has been conveyed in this brief moment we've shared together, because I don't like to leave people with this heavy feeling only. The gravity has a levity that's humor, that's love, that's light, right? Light is very light, right? So I just want to make sure that that comes through in this talk, and hopefully if you read the book, you'll see it in the book.
People are saying in the chat that you've conveyed it. It's come through. Michael quotes James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So besides writing this book yourself, thank you for your work with the Dignidad Literaria, bringing more voices like yours to the scene in the US. It's much appreciated. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to all of our participants for sticking around, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another event.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight. Read the book, be in touch, be well, stay safe, everybody.
Gracias.
Thank you.